everyone, this is Jackie Tucker, Self-Represented Litigation Network. I just want to welcome you to today's SRLN Problem Solving Call. Today is June 11th, 2020, and we are so happy to be joined by Mathias Burton, who is the Director of Product Research and Design at Tyler Technologies. Mathias, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you at this time. Mathias, I think you might be self-muted.
There we go. Is that working okay now?
That works.
Okay, sorry about that. I was hitting the unmute button multiple times with my computer deciding at that moment it did not want to work. So, all right. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you everybody for giving me some time to share out some of my knowledge and experience. As Catherine noted, I work at Tyler Technologies. I run a product research and design team. That can be a bit of an ambiguous title. So just to give some context to the kinds of things that I do, I spend a lot of my time researching how products are used in government, how those products are received by the end users, whether that be the public or internal facing employees. And I particularly look for ways to measure the quality of an experience that somebody has on a product. And one of the tools that I use very often is usability testing. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what I mean by that or how to think about that. But you can kind of capture it as a broader objective behind user feedback with people going through your court systems or going through any of your services that you provide. I'll try to give a few different examples of work that I've done over the past decade or so, but I'm more than happy to start to steer these towards topics that make sense to the folks on the phone. So especially as we get to the latter part of this and are asking questions, please bring up as many concrete examples of things that you think usability testing might be useful for, and we can kind of jump in from there. All right. Just to kind of set the stage, I wanted to give an idea of what I mean by usability testing and some of the steps that kind of go into that. It's essentially a standard process in the human-centered design workflow at this point. And what it really comes down to is a way to evaluate a service, a product, an experience that somebody kind of has. And regardless of what you're testing, there's usually at least 4 or 5 steps, but here I'm trying to break it a little bit broader. To kind of note out some of the core things that are happening. From planning a test through recruiting participants and preparing materials, really what you're doing is establishing a type of evaluation that you want to do. Setting up an environment often has to do with having a service be able to be simulated or be able to walk through an experience that somebody's having. Conducting the test is probably the most straightforward, which is spending time with people either simulating or walking through an experience that they've had with your service. And of course, you want to be able to analyze that data, but in many ways, the data itself is can be kind of self-discoverable. So there's a lot of insight to have just in actually conducting the test itself. And finally, is actually reporting. And sometimes reporting is to yourself, so it's about the actions that you take on it. But it can also be to a stakeholder or someone who has the ability to get more funding towards a project or allow you to innovate on something that you're kind of going forward on. Today, I'm going to really spend time on about 3 of these steps, particularly because we're talking about remote testing. And with that, I just want to give an example of how I think about a process and what I've used in the past. So this is an example of a remote test that I ran with the Seattle Department of Transportation on a couple of maps that they use to share out where their parking services are available and how people are using them out in the wild. And so you can kind of get an idea, many of the topics that I just noted on the previous slide are still there. So remote or in person, I really do kind of follow a lot of this workflow to the T. And so with that said, I want to kind of jump into like what kind of variables come up into a usability test. The first is just around structure. Like I said, I'm mostly focused on remote, but there's a big difference between a type of usability test you would run remote versus being in person with a group of people. Remotely, you lose a lot of context, but you do gather their digital context. So for example, if you have a service that begins with somebody submitting a form online, remote can actually be better for capturing that context than in person. But it is important to note the differences and the ways in which you engage with your participants along the way. Another part of that is being moderated versus unmoderated. And this really has to do with the way in which you convey the tasks that you set up in your test. I'll come back to tasks in a moment, but the way that you set up a test for your participants, really, you play a role in that as the facilitator of a usability study. And an unmoderated test actually removes you from the equation, so you solely have a script that you put in front of someone, and they can do at any time. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility as to when and where you run a test, whereas moderated does involve essentially setting up a meeting or an interview session with someone. The second part of this is the actual style of a test. And so I'm using the word test a lot, but very much these can be close to an interview session at times. It really depends on how granular the service you're studying needs to be studied. So whether it's a really concrete set of steps or it's something in which somebody needs to prove their understanding can really make a really large difference. I'm going to come back to the difference of task-based versus understanding-based in a little bit. But another part of this is just how many people are involved in a usability study. The classical view of this is to do one-on-one evaluations, but there can be a lot of value in having more than one participant take place, especially if it's a repeated service that people may use, say, multiple times in their experience or interaction with a system. So either focus groups or group interviews can have a lot of value to add to this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that, but not much today. And then the last part is the value that you're getting back as either a structure of the test or as a participant taking place in the test. So the first part of this is just how you compensate your participants. Sometimes you don't have the ability to give any compensation, so that kind of lends itself to more of like a being able to be involved in some improvement or value change in an infrastructure. But practically speaking, compensation is a pretty standard practice at this point. So based on the number of minutes you spend with a participant, assuming you provide some sort of compensation for them, whether it be just with gratitude or thank you. Gift cards are very common, and I'll come back to just how to think about that a little bit more too. And then the last one can be a little bit more academic, but for folks that are familiar with different research design methods, within subject means that I'm going to be spending time with an individual through multiple sets of tasks. So for example, if I'm filing a number of different forms at one time, following somebody from the beginning to end would be a within subject experience of that, whereas a between subject experience is going to be evaluating each individual form, but with different participants at each one of them. So you can learn more about individual forms, but not necessarily how they flow together. So these are sort of choices that you can make and trade-offs that you can kind of consider. I gave a talk a few years back about being penny-wise and pound-wise, an article that was written about usability studies a while back, and some of the things to kind of consider as you're kind of going along. So it's a little more fun than some of my other slides because I use the cartoon style at this point. But there's a number of things that can go wrong in setting up one of these usability studies. The first is just a selection of evaluators. A very common part of that process that I set up at the beginning is to have a screener or a way in which you recruit participants and then select some over others. What you select on can be a very problematic part of your usability test. So being very mindful of how you're recruiting, what bias you might have in that recruiting can be a significant barrier. Similarly, recruiting itself takes a lot of time. So it's a little bit different doing that online than it is doing this in, say, your local court or your library. It changes things when you're doing it from a remote perspective. And similarly, like the incentives that you give can give different people motivation to be involved. So all three of those come back to recruiting, which is why I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that more in depth. But all three of those things really are trade-offs that you have to make as you're going through this. Like, you may want to budget time, but you may have a limited amount of it. Team politics can play into this. So whether it's yourself or a group of people, this may or may not be as relevant to this group, but can be a significant function. So who's responsible for what is an important thing to kind of get out of the way. International testing is a bit of a proxy to note that not everybody speaks great English. And so if you plan things around, especially in the legal space with language that isn't necessarily understood, you can set up new barriers that make things more complicated. So making sure it's in the language of the participants that are involved. And then finally is team involvement. And what I mean by this is either the stakeholders that are organizing or orchestrating services above you, as well as the people that are participating in your test itself. Involving them in any solutions that you might build out the other end is a really important and major way to get more success out of running usability study. Or in depth to remote studies, and you'll note, like, I'm using some of these titles of the variables along the way here, because I do want to note that there are ways to kind of think about these environments. I have run usability tests in all 5 of these environments to differing degrees of success. Most commonly at Tyler Technologies, we use GoToMeeting. So our protocol is to recruit participants, we schedule a meeting, and we set up a GoToMeeting and a link at least 24 hours in advance of meeting with a person. And then from there, like, we spend the next day preparing that with about an hour in advance just being prepped to be on a call. That depends on how efficient we feel with the actual GoToMeeting setup, but that's my most common go-to. At my prior work, I worked at ProQuest. I used WebEx quite frequently. And one of the pros over GoToMeeting with WebEx was the ability to actually record calls online. That is now available in GoToMeeting, but Cisco also tends to have a little bit more reliable of a phone interface. GoToMeeting has cut out on me a few different times. Most recently, I've seen Zoom do quite well, especially during coronavirus and its outbreak. Zoom has been the most commonly used, and one of its pitfalls is the privacy aspect of it. People can enter and exit out of rooms. I do think they finally have put a patch on that as of the last couple of months, but that is a major concern if you're talking about things that are private, that you don't want any public domain knowledge of. Google Hangouts sits somewhere in between on this. It's probably the least reliable of calls that I've been on, but it tends to be the most accessible. Google's entire framework works very good for accessibility studies. So, for example, we recently did some usability evaluations with blind individuals and had to do that through Zoom. But when we practiced it on Google Hangouts, it worked just fine. And moving to Zoom suddenly added a new layer of barriers. So that's kind of a key thing to kind of notice. Like, actually evaluating this out and using different tools can help quite a bit. I do want to acknowledge that it's not always available for one to select their tool, so you do have to kind of take what you get. And BlueJeans is a tool that's built by Facebook and has been really reliable, but isn't exactly the cheapest of solutions, and so may or may not be really eligible for use. The last thing I just want to note on here is that when I do group work, I often use Zoom, particularly because Zoom has one feature that many of these don't, which is breakout rooms. A couple of the other tools have variations of breakout rooms, or you can set up different tables. But Zoom has the most efficient way to do this and allows the facilitator to kind of split people into groups. So if you have a slightly more complex structure, or if you have sub-segments of people that you want to pull together and have discussions from, Zoom can be a much better tool. So another part of this is just thinking about recruiting. When doing in-person testing, a key function to this is to kind of think about how you can get the people that care the most about the topic that you're talking about. And in particular, that can be someone that's just recently used a service that you're providing. But more practically speaking, when you're remote, that involves a very intentional effort and may require some broadening of the pool of candidates that you pull from. A few unmoderated tools that you can use, user testing and dscout, allow a couple of different ways for you to borrow from a large pool of folks. And so you set up your screener, and then those tools set you up with participants along the way. dscout is a bit of a journal study, so it actually lets you set up a feedback over time, whereas user testing is like a systematic, unmoderated flow through their environment. So it actually sets up the environment as well. A tool I've been using recently is called userinterviews.com, which just really takes on the true recruiting function along the way. So this is anywhere from $20 to $50 per participant, but they take the screening recommendations that you give and can sit within either a geographic context or a social context that you want to capture, and can give a lot of feedback going into it. So those are some of the ways in which you can actually use an online pool rather than build your own. I did want to give some suggestions or ways to think about recruiting within a group. So the first is a product user groups. This is something I use at Tyler, which is a preset set of participants. We schedule them for the entire year, so we follow them through a different cycle each year, but with the objective of learning about their experience with the systems that we create, following their jobs and their functions, all the way through to success and failure, involve them at multiple stops. So it's really that within subjects flow, if you will. So it's really great for gathering repeating participants, especially if they're interested in changing the systems that you're working on. Another is just an opt-in community recruiting. So this is establishing a pool as a network. So very similar to user testing or dscout, many groups will set up cohorts around a social issue or social topic. A very common example in my world are civic user testing groups. So these are public groups that different organizations set up and coordinate participant recruits around using public interfaces. So anything that the government is publishing out, they use that as a service to set up and partner with the community. And then the last is just setting up a service loop recruiting, which is to kind of build in recruiting to the actual service itself. So anytime you've been on a call where they've asked if you'll join a short survey after the conversation, that's one way to kind of build in a loop in which recruiting is actually a part of the service itself, which can be really great, but does have some extra requirements to build in to make that operational and effective. Maybe the last little part of this is that while long-term recruiting approaches like these ones here can kind of set up an operational flow, so you've got people kind of coming in, it does come with a cost, which is to manage and sustain that program of recruiting. So it's always worth noting that recruiting can become a really big topic, but it can also be something that's very tactical. So I threw the Google Forms logo up here in the corner because very often what I will do is just post something to either a Facebook group or to Craigslist or any other kind of posting environment, Twitter, and invite people to fill out a Google form. And it takes me little more than an hour to kind of initialize some recruiting. And as long as I'm not looking for too many participants and I'm kind of grading on what I'll call like a low curve, that goes pretty well. Okay, so last really deep dive component I wanted to note about is some of this test design. So there's really kind of like two schools of thought that go into usability testing. Now, if you've never done usability testing before, I'd err on the left side of this as being a little bit more task-based. The two sides of this to kind of think about is task-based being a little bit more focused on, I have an objective as a user as I'm going through this system, right? So I come to a legal aid department, I want to get feedback on my specific problem. How quickly and efficiently can I get through that? Both understanding the problem, getting feedback, and moving forward. Similarly, understanding based takes a similar approach, but focuses a little bit more on the understanding of the flow itself. So while like you can think of task based as kind of like getting the service right, understanding based allows you to get a little bit more of the right service in the first place, right? Did we actually get to solving your problem the way that you thought you were coming here to get that solved, right? So if I'm going to court Did I get the outcome I expected of that? Did I feel a sense of justice through the process? Did I feel like I was heard? Did I feel like I understood what was happening at each stage of that process? That's the kind of focus that an understanding base kind of takes. And really what I'm splitting up here are different parameters to kind of think about. At the top are the ways that I kind of measure the evaluation of a test. So task-based is very much about time or success. So these are kind of the two common criteria you'll hear, which is like, did somebody actually accomplish getting through a test? So you set up a hypothetical task for them to do, and then monitor and watch it as they do it without any intervention. And if they can accomplish it, that gives you a sense of whether or not it's an understandable flow. As opposed to, say, self-discovery, where you're going to have a little bit more of a discussion guide that's a little bit less script-oriented. And really what you're looking for is whether they get to their value in the first place. Can they discover it on their own? Or is there some problems with the actual structure of the system as it's set up? I also split the number of participants that I'm able to handle depending on how I set this up. So task-based allows usually for a larger pool of participants and benefits from getting to a normal curve, but does kind of fall off after about 20 to 30 participants. It's still very much a qualitative method, even with some of its quantitative structure. So it's really important to not try to get too caught up in the numbers of a usability evaluation. They can be distracting from kind of the core function. And then lastly, I really focus on task-based tests being a little bit shorter so that they kind of focus into a specific area that I'm trying to improve. Whereas an understanding-based can be a little bit of more of a deep dive. So sometimes it's only 30 minutes. I've done tests as long as 90 minutes, but I try to avoid getting too far into evaluating any kind of test from a long standpoint, because at some point you start to get into a long interview and you also get participant fatigue. So 90 minutes is more rare, 60 minutes is relatively common. I'm not going to spend too much time on specific examples because I do want to share out some of my thoughts on what y'all are working on in your spaces. But just to give an example, this is Seattle DOT's parking map. And as you can kind of tell, there's a heck of a lot that's going on. It's an Esri map with multiple layers. It has line and point data on top of it with different markings that people were supposed to understand to identify and find different parking spots. Specifically, one of the tasks that we set up was to see, could people find out whether or not their address was eligible for RPZ permits, registered parking zones. So this is a pretty common task and one of the objectives that the group set up, but it was buried inside of all of this. And as you can note, it's one of the only items that isn't checked on demand, particularly because it overlaps some of the other maps. And so we watched people try to use this map to evaluate and identify whether or not their address was eligible. And as you can tell, about half of them could not even figure out how to turn on the layer. The other three that did really didn't get to that service until they searched on their actual browser window for RPZ and then found this item here and then finally found their way through. So what we ended up suggesting was actually to split this off as a separate service rather than be embedded in with all of the other parking solutions that were there. So just a really quick example of how usability tests led to a completely different design of a service that the city was providing. And we also noted that like the understanding of the actual mark itself was kind of ambiguous. So we ended up working with them to make it a little bit more legible, as well as change the color contrast along the way. So just in closing, I want to note, like, this is not an overwhelming topic. It can be very learnable. I really recommend Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think. It focuses on web and mobile usability, but practically speaking, it really just focuses on how to run these things without being overwhelmed by the process. For anyone that's really interested in conducting these on a systematic basis over a long period of time, I recommend Dana Chisnell's book, which is the Handbook of Usability Testing. This is a lot more intensive and is a lot more useful when you're thinking about in-person tests, particularly because they give you ideas about how to sit next to your participants and set up your posture in relation to the person next to you. A lot of that's pretty much removed from a remote test and so can be a bit of an overkill. So I'll pause there. I went a little bit over and I will let people ask some questions to me from there.